Hi, I'm delighted to introduce you to Dr. Steve Boreham, a well-known ecologist and geologist who came to Orwell on the 7th of October for our launch of our environmental group to see what we can do to protect and preserve the environment of Orwell and its surroundings. Steve, you gave a fascinating presentation and you've agreed very kindly to repeat that this evening so more people can see it. So without further ado, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Let me just share my screen. There we go. Does that look good to you, Nick?
It looks fantastic. Perfect.
Okay, everybody. Well, look, my talk is about Orwell Pit, which was recently designated as a local geological site, and a little bit about the potential for rewilding areas of Orwell. And I have some experience of this with Reach Village, where I've assisted the parish council with something similar. So without further ado, let's talk about Orwell. And I can't help noticing that Orwell is situated in a sort of magic triangle. It's between Cambridge and Camborne and Royston. And it's situated on the edge of the valley of the River Ree. So it's a nice auspicious place to be located. If we zoom in onto Orwell Village, what you're looking at here is a geology map of Orwell Village, and up on top of Toot Hill here you can see what we used to call boulder clay. It's glacial till. It's literally clay with boulders in it, left behind by a huge ice sheet. And underneath that you can see this green area, and this is chalk. So this is chalk bedrock from the Cretaceous period, perhaps 80 or 100 million years old. And the location of Orwell Pit is shown by this red dot. And down at the bottom of the slope, you can see a series of springs along the junction between the chalk and the gault clay. And in particular, you have a lovely spring there at Chapel Orchard. This is the Chapel Orchard spring, joining together with the outflow from all the other springs to form the River Orwell. And the reason for this spring line is the jointed and porous nature of the chalk, full of water as an aquifer, sitting on top of the impermeable gault clay. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about Orwell Pit, and we know that the grassland is a site of special scientific interest and a centre of biodiversity. And of course, we now know that the glebe field next to Orwell Pit has been designated as a county wildlife site, which provides an amount of protection. And the reason for me telling you about Orwell Pit and its geology is that now Orwell Pit has been designated as a local geological site, which also confers some level of protection. And specifically, the reason for Orwell Pit being designated as a local geological site is the fact that the very edge of this glacial till overlies some periglacial deposits and then the West Melbury Marley chalk, which is the bedrock. And the basis for the local geological site designation is on scientific, educational, historical and aesthetic grounds. Indeed, the glebe field and the pit itself together as such a centre of biodiversity, I think that it would be a great idea if Orwell could organise some kind of BioBlitz event in the summer of 2022 to bring the community together to really understand and appreciate the gem that they have sitting on the hill above the village. So let's talk about the geology briefly. Obviously, this is a photograph of the exposure. You can see it's a very small exposure relative to the size of the pit, and yet it encapsulates some really interesting details. So zooming in on the exposure of chalk here, you might have been forgiven for thinking this was fairly boring and trivial. But when you unpick it, as I did with Penny Coggill and Steve Daniels and David Brooks from the Cambridge Geological Society, you can see that there's lots of different things going on, lots of different layers. Now, geologists do it from the bottom up, and you can see that much of the pit is obscuring what you can see in the geology. But the bottom part of the exposure is these large shattered chalk blocks with what looks like pellet chalk injected between them. And in fact, this is where the caves have started to form. And overlying or on top of the chalk blocks and pellet chalk is some very fine-grained white chalk putty. Now, the chalk putty and the chalk blocks and the pellet chalk all come from periglacial conditions. So this is where an ice sheet during a glacial period is some distance from Orwell, but the freeze and thaw created by that glacial climate ruins the chalk. It crushes it up, it dissolves it and turns it to mush. And what you're seeing here in the section is the product of that intense periglacial freezing and thawing. And on the top, apart from the topsoil, is a thin layer of, and I'm calling it here dimicton, which is the technical name. The old name would be boulder clay, clay with boulders in it. It might be called glacial till. And this is a clayey, silty material, and it's full of exotic material. That is, pebbles and fragments of rock which are not from this area. And you can see that the junction between the dimicton or the till has been forced into these rather strange finger-like structures called involutions. And this is a sure sign of more freezing and thawing under periglacial conditions. When you look at the section, though, you might say, well, I can't really see any of that. It's not very clear. So an overlay like this will help, and you can see the topsoil here at the top, and then the till or the dimicton, and you can see these involutions regularly spaced along the section, protruding down into the chalk putty beneath. So I did some analyses of the dimicton, the till, looking specifically at the pebbles. So don't get upset by this word. Clast simply means a pebble. Over 2/3 of the pebbles in that till are clearly of local origin. They're chalk, they're flints and so on. But just under 1/3 of the pebbles in that dimicton or till come from sources further away than the local area. Gryphea, the other name is devil's toenail, is a very characteristic Jurassic fossil. It's a shell, and there's fragments of Jurassic limestone, Jurassic sandstone. All of these maybe come from the Peterborough area, for example, but a small proportion of quartz clearly comes from much further afield, perhaps the Pennines or northern England. So this tells us that the ice which moved across Orwell thousands of years ago must have come from a more sort of northerly direction. And this map shows the spread of the ice during the most extensive glaciation we know of, the Anglian glaciation. It lasted between about 420 and 480,000 years ago. It was about 1 kilometre thick as it went over Orwell. And it ended up in North London, Barnet, and Hornchurch is about as far as it got in Essex. And you can see the direction of the ice flow coming down towards Orwell and the Cambridge district. If you have a look at a superficial geology map of East Anglia, this is a map which shows not the bedrock but all of the more recent deposits. You can see this large area of blue, and this is all boulder clay or till, glacial till, or diamicton as we might call it. So this is the ground up material that was squashed underneath the ice sheet as it advanced. And you might see this halo of pink along the East Anglian coast, and this is all the outwash sands and gravels that came from the edge of the ice. And you can see the position of Orwell, this red dot, quite clearly south of something called the Madingley Plateau. Indeed, if we have a look at this detailed map, you can now see the extent of the Madingley Plateau, and you can see all of that till or boulder clay. And here's Orwell, and you can see our little spur just above the village. Now, I know these are called superficial deposits, but you know, sometimes they reach 50 metres thick, and there's really nothing superficial about that. The other colours on this map, the blue is gold clay, and the greens here are chalk. And I don't know if you can see right down in the bottom right hand corner, there's more till or boulder clay. And you can see that the Ree Valley, and this is the course of the River Ree, there's almost no deposits in it, is between the ramparts formed by the boulder clay to the north and the boulder clay to the south around Hayden and Chisel and Barkway. If I put a geological section across the valley quite close to Orwell, it looks something a bit like this. Over here we've got in the west the River Ouse Valley, and then this is the Madingley Plateau around Longstow and Hatley. And if you have a look over here, this is the scale. So this is just 50 metres in thickness, and you can see there's 50 metres of glacial till or boulder clay underneath East Hatley. In contrast, you can see the River Ree, a big open valley leading up to Chisel or Hayden or Barley in this case. And you can just make out here the boulder clay on the other rampart over on the eastern side. So this is the west, this is the east. So how did this form? Well, there's a very strong amount of evidence that originally there was a large chalk scarp reaching almost 200 metres high in the position of the River Ree Valley, capped over with remnant materials, clay with flints and so on. And that there was a deep, deep vale in the gold clay and another little escarpment here in the green sand. It's not just me that thinks this. A chap called Clayton, more than 20 years ago, made this reconstruction of this chalk escarpment from North Norfolk through Suffolk, past Ely, Cambridge, down through Hertfordshire. And the geological section that we were just looking at going past Orwell is just here. So how did the area form? Well, if there was a great big escarpment like this, it would have represented a significant impediment to the progress of the Anglian ice sheet, which must have hit the escarpment and been held up by it for an amount of time. And here you can see a lodgement till. This is what ultimately becomes the Madingley Plateau at the foot, that's to the west, of that escarpment. But eventually that ice sheet managed to push over the top of the escarpment, ripping huge lumps of chalk off the top of the escarpment and effectively flushing away any clay with flints or armouring material on the top, and ultimately laying down some boulder clay or till over towards the east around around Chisel or Hayden. After the ice disappeared, what we had is a somewhat denuded chalk escarpment with till to the east and till to the west. And if I tell you that chalk itself does not like being frozen, freeze thaw literally turns chalk to a liquid putty which can simply ooze away, perhaps you'll understand it. We call it an incompetent strata. In contrast, the boulder clay or the till is quite competent in the face of periglacial activity. It forms an armour plate. And so 400,000 years of intense freeze thaw ultimately gives us the profile that we have today. And of course, this location here is where Orwell Pit is, just on the edge of the Madingley Till Plateau, underlain by chalk and looking out across this broad clay and chalk vale towards the hills over towards Hayden and Chisel and yes, perhaps Barley. And of course, this is that glorious view. So perhaps now that explains somewhat why the pit at Orwell has been designated as a local geological site, because it's one of the very few places that this particular story can be seen and told. I'd like now to move on to talk about the potential for rewilding and conservation within Orwell Parish, and I feel I'm able to do this because I have a fair amount of experience in helping Reach Parish Council, where I live, do some similar things. Now, just because these are my experiences, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing, so I might be suggesting things and you say, no, that wouldn't work here, and that's absolutely fine. But there are some basic tenets which I think you might find quite useful as guidance. And I'd like to introduce you to the 3 W's of rewilding and conservation, and it boils down to this. Woods, so think about trees, scrub, woodland, really valuable for biodiversity. The second W is water, think about springs, wetlands, ponds and streams, and wildflowers. And this is all about rewilding meadows, footpaths, rights of way, verges, and changing mowing patterns. And the first place to start, we found, was having an inventory. This is all about knowing what you have and where it is. It's the best place to start. So I've done a little bit of desktop work just to kick this off. So we're looking at here is a graphic map of Orwell Parish. This is the boundary, and you can see the pit is marked here with a red dot. And the area of the parish is almost 860 hectares. And my first question is, how much of this is arable? Well, using this Google Earth image, we can see about 70% of Orwell Parish is arable land. And this flags up a really important thing, that without the participation of the farmers and the landowners, making a real impact in the parish is going to be quite difficult. So you really need to be on good terms with them. If you have a look at the geology, you can see that just a little under 100 hectares in your parish from the ridgetop down is on boulder clay or till. There's about 145 hectares of steep chalky slopes. That's where Orwell Pit is, and you know how valuable those slopes can be for grassland, chalk grassland with a plethora of wildflowers, a biodiversity hotspot. And then we have a large expanse, just over half of the parish is Galt clay. There are some chalk flats down by the river and a tiny amount of alluvium. So let's start with woodland. There's about 18 hectares of woodland within the parish. That's just 2% of the area, and that is something you could certainly look to improve, because obviously woodland is really useful as a biodiverse habitat. And if we have a look at what's protected, you can see that the National Trust own 11 hectares. That's more than half of all the woodland in the parish. And the rest of it's fragmented and so on. And apart from the SSSI at Orwell Pit, the nearest other protected wildlife sites are the Elmore at Shepreth down here outside the parish, and Barrington Pit, which is a site of special interest for geology. If you have a look at the water resources within Orwell, you've got about 14 kilometres of watercourses of one kind or another, and all of them seem to be chalk spring fed streams, and this is really important, and many of them join together to form the River Orwell, which flows down and is confluent with the River Ree. So the River Orwell itself is there's almost 9 kilometres of streams associated with the River Orwell, and you've got a 4-kilometre stretch of the River Ree, which itself is a chalk stream. So, you know, you have some decent water resources. And the other thing I notice is that you've got about 10 kilometres of public rights of way. And the battle here is to make these as good as they possibly can be for chalky wildflowers. These could be really beautiful centres for biodiversity, and this might involve changing mowing regimes, sowing wildflower seeds and so on. So real negotiations with the landowners to try and make the most of these routes, which can become wildlife corridors. Really important, for example, for butterflies. I thought I'd show you this slide because in Reach Village it became quite clear to us that what we needed was a tree inventory with a map and a risk register. And in this involved the tree officer and myself visiting all the trees, and in the end there was more than 150 trees in the parish that we needed on public lands we needed to identify. We decided what the trees were, what form they took, if they needed any works, pruning, removal of ivy, or if they were dangerous, and we knew exactly where they were. This has been absolutely invaluable for working out costs for management, replanting or planting new trees. We've planted a few avenues on the approach roads to the village, and we've also planted community woodlands. And that's another idea that you might like the sound of. This is a picture from a drone of Reach 24 acres. It's a community woodland. I designed it and helped plant it. It was entirely planted by the community, funded by the Forestry Commission on land rented to the parish by the National Trust on a peppercorn rent. And you can see here we have a community orchard, we have a cricket pitch, and then we have the trees here. You might say, well, it doesn't look very impressive, but if you saw it, this was a couple of years after it was planted. It's 8 or 9 years old now, and we're starting to get closed canopy. But in Reach, this isn't the only community woodland we have. 26 years ago, the Woodland Trust allowed members of Reach Village to plant a different woodland up on the hill here. You can probably just see it here, and I'm the warden of that wood, and it's coming on really nicely. Closed canopy now, really important for wildlife. And even the county council has been convinced to plant up some of their farmland and create a community woodland. So there's an awful lot that can be done when people come together with a focus trying to create biodiverse areas. So we've talked a bit about woodland. What about water? So here's a lovely chalk stream. And you've got a lot of chalk-fed streams. And the crucial thing about chalk streams is the water quality and the water quantity. So the first thing I think you need to ask when you see a stream is, does it have perennial flow? If it has perennial flow, that means all through the year, then the chances are it supports some really interesting invertebrates and possibly fish. Are there any possible sources of pollution? Urban pollution, agricultural pollution, and can something be done to mitigate that? And don't forget the riparian or bankside habitats here, which can be incredibly useful for things like nesting kingfishers and bank voles, water voles, and so on. And the in-channel management is often a sore point with these types of streams. At its best, the stream can be encouraged to flow down these gravel riffles swiftly into pools where trout can lie. At its very worst, a JCB has come along and just cleared out everything from the channel and dumped it on the bank, which then erupts into 2-metre high nettles. And you have a choice. You can negotiate with landowners to try and go for the very best habitat. And diversity of habitat creates biodiversity, a large number of plants and animal species. So let's talk about wildflowers. And this is an image of volunteers in Reach planting wildflower seed in a chalky meadow by hand. It's just a small trial area, but the area had already had about 30 species of wildflower, but not some of the signature species that we would expect to see on chalky grassland. So we've had a go at introducing them. And as always, it's all about the mowing regime. For example, your road verges, they might actually either have some really interesting wildflowers, or they could have interesting wildflowers if they were cut just once a year. As long as that doesn't cause problems with sight lines. There is such a thing as a protected road verge where the county council archaeologist has identified chalkland plants, for example, growing, but unless they come and look at your invitation, you'll never know. So it's all about protecting what you've got, making sure the mowing regime isn't destroying anything of use, and planting up along rights of way, scraps of meadow and so on, where biodiversity doesn't already exist. So in summary, what is the potential then, in my opinion, for rewilding and conservation within Orwell Parish? And I think there are a few things to consider. For example, in Reach, the neighbourhood plan has been really, really important in securing conservation initiatives for the future. We paid as part of the neighbourhood plan, we paid for an ecological survey, which has paid back the relatively modest cost in all kinds of interesting ways. And having a biodiversity action plan as part of the neighbourhood plan tells people what they can expect and how we're going to get there. It's a route map for the future. And the biggest message to take away from this, we found, was communication. Involve the whole community. Involve everyone, because it's only when everyone understands and gets behind the idea of promoting wildlife and biodiversity that real change can happen. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm happy to take a couple of questions if we have time for it, Nick.
No, thank you. That was brilliant. And I mean, your thing about involving the community, you know, there were so many people who couldn't make it. We were packed out, but there were some people who couldn't make it. They were away for whatever reason. They heard about your talk and they wanted to see it. So thank you so much for taking the time to do it again. It's the second time, obviously, I've seen it, and it was even better the second time. So thank you. And you just go away and you just think, yeah, actually, there is so much potential. Some things are really simple that can make a big difference. Just a couple of points from me. You mentioned BioBlitz. What is, for those of it not in the know, what is a BioBlitz? What does it involve?
Well, wearing my other hat as a trustee of Hobson's Conduit, I've organised several BioBlitz events for them on the edge of Cambridge. And basically, we run mini BioBlitzes, usually on a Saturday afternoon, overnight and into a Sunday morning. We gather together a handful of experts, people who are expert in bird watching, in insects, in fish, in plants, in moths and butterflies. I'm sure you can find these people in your local area. And we give them an hour and we say, OK, general public turns up and they walk around the site and going, oh, this is a very interesting plant. How about this one? And it all gets written down and people learn. They bring things to a central area. They say, oh, I found this, a photograph or something. Yes, we know what that is. And so what we do is over a 24-hour period, you can imagine overnights, the bats and the moths, really, really exciting. Lots of children getting excited about being allowed to stay up and look at the moths and listen to the bats with the echo sounders. And we build up a list of, typically we get 200 species of plants and animals from a 24-hour mini BioBlitz event. Very successful, doesn't have to be expensive, and really engages the community.
So anyone can get involved. We bring a few experts, but anyone, from kids onwards can get involved and sort of come and have a look and see what's here.
Absolutely. In one of our BioBlitzes, we even had bushcraft demonstrations and what have you. So it turned into a bit of a jamboree, and sort of, teachers who teach forest schools were doing taster sessions in the woods and what have you as well. So and there's a little bit of catering, and it can become a real community binding event where everybody gets behind this idea of promoting biodiversity.
I think that's so exciting. And the things you've talked about, particularly, from the wildflowers to the trees to the hedgerows, are things that we can all get involved in. You mentioned a few times the chalk streams, particularly interest of mine. I mean, why are they so special? Is it right we've only got 220 in the world and 85% are in England, and most of them in the south of England? Is that right?
That's about right. I mean, there's chalk streams in France, of course. But we've got the lion's share of chalk streams, and one of the problems is lack of water, because of course we all want water to drink and wash in and use our washing machines and so on, and very many chalk streams are having their water taken by the water companies to supply human needs. And of course the Cam Valley Forum, who I'm loosely involved with, are thinking very strongly now about trying to make sure the River Ree and the Granter and the Cam have enough water, and the water doesn't get taken so much that those chalk springs and those chalk streams dry up. And of course there are some very, very rare and special animals and plants that can only live in water that comes from the chalk stream, full of calcium carbonate, of course.
Would you suggest that, as the first thing we do a proper ecological survey to see what we've got?
An inventory, yes, yeah. And of course, you don't have to do the whole parish at once. You can start small and you can work out in concentric rings. And it's a bit like, a snowball gathering momentum. It gets bigger and bigger, because when, people go, oh, I've no idea how to do this. And you dip your toe in the water and you do it, and people go, oh, this was great. Can we do more of it? And you go, yes. And I've done a lot of work training people and empowering people to feel that they can go out and do this kind of survey work. And it's all about community engagement and taking ownership and saying, this is great, but it could even be better if we did this. So that survey work, you can get for the neighbourhood plan, I really recommend professional ecologists, but there's a lot of community involvement, and there's always, in any parish, there are lots and lots of enthusiastic amateurs.
Well, I mean, that's how we saved Chapel Orchard from being developed 15 years ago.
Sure.
A group of other people saved it for the village, and we want to do that and preserve that. Final question from me. I don't want to keep you late at night. You mentioned wildlife corridors. Why are wildlife? What do you mean by wildlife corridors, and why are they important, and what we can do about them?
Well, looking at, for example, Hobson's Brook, it forms a wildlife corridor, a green space, which comes from the countryside, and it pushes right into the centre of Cambridge City. Once areas of wildlife biodiversity get isolated, and it doesn't have to be just by urban areas, it can be by huge tracts of arable land, or even just playing fields, which are effectively ryegrass deserts. Yeah. Those areas of wildlife become small, they become isolated, and then they can't sustain themselves, and then they just degrade. Whereas if you can link up like a series of pearls in a pearl necklace, yeah, you can create a wildlife corridor, and a butterfly can flit from flower to flower to flower to flower, breed, lay eggs, and perpetuate itself. Whereas if it finds itself in a little fragment of land surrounded by urban area, arable and ryegrass desert, it won't find a mate, it won't lay eggs, and it will die out. So it's simply having a critical mass of wildlife sites, and that doesn't mean endless tracts of rewilding, but it does mean small things, small changes that we can make could make enormous differences to the viability of animals and plants.
Double the width of some of our hedgerows, for instance. Would that work?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the continuity of hedgerows, and this comes under my W for woodland, so trees, woodland, but also scrub and hedgerows, as well as tracts of woodlands, community orchards. As long as you can draw a kind of spider's web, so any animal like a hedgehog or a butterfly or a bird can go from food source to food source and move through the parish, rather than just finding itself at a dead end or being isolated. It's the smallest of things we can do, and can make enormous differences to the beleaguered wildlife.
So we could think about how we could link to the Wimple estate, how we could link to Barrington, how we could link to Meldreth, how we could link to the River Ree. Those are the sort of connections. Over to Arrington, it's Wimple. It's those sort of connections that we need to look at to allow.
Absolutely. And I think the National Trust might be prepared to be very helpful. They've certainly been very helpful in Reach Village.
No, they seem to be keen to do a lot around here. They've been very open to ideas. So I think there's a real opportunity now to do something. So, Steve, I'm not going to take any more of your evening. You've already given us one evening. You've now given us a second evening. A very big thank you for recording this. I know people were keen to see it, so really do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Nick. You're very welcome.